Hi, this is Dave Litton from Projex Academy and a warm welcome to our Microsoft Project 365 for Scrum, Kanban and Hybrid projects. And this masterclass will consist first of all of 7 modules, this being the first of course, which will be taking you through the various aspects of Scrum, Kanban and Hybrid projects. So you have a thorough understanding of the backdrop of using such projects with Microsoft Project 365. And therefore on Module 8, I shall be firing up Microsoft Project and demonstrating to you exactly how to use that very powerful tool to run and manage your adaptive projects. Okay, so to start with, let me give you a bit of an overview of Scrum itself and describe the way in which a Scrum project is different to a traditional plan-driven or waterfall project. So let's roll our sleeves up and get stuck straight in. First of all, I want to give you a sort of a backdrop here to the way in which Scrum works. As you can see, these are so-called adaptive projects which form part of the umbrella agile term, and these are different to traditional waterfall projects called plan-driven projects. And Scrum, which is one of many agile approaches, implements the principles of agile in the form of a set of what's called artifacts, practices and roles responsibilities. Don't worry, we'll be covering those in these first 7 modules. Now with Scrum, rather than having a Gantt chart with a time frame possibly split into management stages, a Scrum Lifecycle is completed in fixed time periods called sprints. These sprints are also called time boxes, one and the same. However, Scrum uses the term sprints, and each sprint is typically 1 to 4 weeks long. And so sprints are also called time boxes, and what differentiates sprints and time boxes from traditional projects is that with a traditional project you tie down scope and then work out the time needed to carry that out. With sprints or time boxes, which have therefore a fixed non-negotiable endpoint, what is varied within each sprint is the scope itself. Now let's start off then at the left hand side, the so-called product backlog. This is a prioritized list of user stories. Sometimes these user stories are called features, other times requirements. But the important thing to note here is that the product backlog is prioritized from the top downwards, where the features or user stories at the top are those deemed most important and of the highest priority from a business perspective for your customers and users. The features at the top are also those which are known in detail, so that as we go down this prioritized list, the features become less well understood at this moment and also of a lower priority. Now, since Scrum is a framework used by teams to manage work and to solve problems collaboratively in short cycles, it's of no surprise that what we want to do is to take those prioritized features off the top of the product backlog, and that sublist, if you will, is therefore called the sprint backlog, and after sprint planning, convert these features into products that could be potentially shipped or given to the customer. Let's go back then. So the individual who manages and prioritizes the product backlog is called the product owner, and it's the Scrum team or the development team themselves who actually take those features and to convert them via tasks into products. And therefore it's the development team that decide what features from the product backlog can be converted into products in this next sprint. So although I've shown sprint backlog being chosen here and then you carry out sprint planning on it, in effect these are both done in parallel in an iterative manner, where the team, the development team, would look at these features and through sprint planning determine how many of these we can deliver within the upcoming sprint. That being done, as part of sprint planning, each of these features are planned and estimated in terms of work so we can understand what tasks can be carried out in this sprint. So sprint planning will be estimating and determining what the tasks are needed for each of these features to actually create the product. This step of the sprint is therefore called the sprint execution. However, let's suppose we're underway, then every day, and hence its name, a daily scrum occurs. Sometimes this can be called a daily stand-up. The reason being is because the daily scrum is intended to be short, typically 15 minutes or so. And the team stand up together and quickly go through each of the team members in a round-robin fashion and determine for each individual what they achieved yesterday, what they intend to achieve today, and are there any problems or issues or impediments that need to be resolved. The daily scrum held, the team then get back to their work, going through these tasks and creating the products. Near the end of the sprint, which can be up to 4 weeks long, as I've said, we'll have something called a sprint review. Now, a sprint review is a bit of a demonstration, if you will, to show the customers and users what has been created. It's more than that, however, as we'll see later, but that's in essence what it's there to do. So the sprint review presents the completed products that have occurred during this current sprint. And any products that are demonstrated here must be, by definition, potentially shippable products or a potentially shippable increment, where an increment, of course, is one or more products that could be passed on to the customer. It doesn't have to be. For example, you may have several sprints ultimately resulting in a release to the customer. So hence we use the word potentially shippable. That's an important word, however, because it means that that product is indeed 100% complete. After the sprint review, again nearing the end of the sprint, there'll be something called a sprint retrospective, which, as the name suggests, we look back at what we've achieved and seek out anything that can be improved, whether it's at a process level or human or what have you. More of that later. And of course, as a result of the sprint retrospective, it may well be that changes to the sprint backlog are suggested, then these would be addressed for when the next sprint is planned. So therefore, a typical Scrum lifecycle is a set of sprints carried out one after the other, each incrementally contributing to the products of the project. So there it is, a very simplistic overview of the Scrum lifecycle. We'll unpack that in more detail as we continue with the rest of the videos. Now, it's important to understand that fairly recently there has been some changes to the Scrum Guide, which originally was launched back in around the year 2000. These are merely updates and clarifications. It's not that Scrum is changing in any way, and these should be reflected in the execution of Scrum as I describe how it will be used with Microsoft Project. So let's talk about the Scrum Master role to start with. We'll address the others in a later video. The Scrum Master's purpose is there to significantly improve team performance by helping everyone understand Scrum theory and practice, and also, where needed, to do so not just within the Scrum team but across the organisation. And this role also includes leading, training and coaching the organisation in its adoption and adaptation of the Scrum framework. It's important to understand the new term, the term called the self-managing Scrum team. This consists of the Scrum Master, the product owner and the development team themselves. You see, there's only just one team, called the Scrum team, focused on the same objective with different sets of accountabilities for these roles that I've yet to discuss: the product owner, Scrum Master, which I've just touched on, and the development team themselves. Now, development teams are self-managing Scrum teams, and it is they who choose what to work on. It is they who choose who is going to do it, and it is they who choose how the work will get done. Therefore, the team self-manages to deliver on the commitments to meet the goals. And we'll learn later there are several goals that we need to understand. Now, I touched on in our overview about the Daily Scrum, sometimes called a stand-up meeting. And if you want the truth, it's that if you booked a meeting room and everyone sat around in comfortable chairs, then it's highly likely that it would turn into an hour meeting and it would be well off topic. The focus of the Daily Scrum, or Daily Stand-Up, is to ensure that the sprint is on track to achieve its goals, and if necessary, to adapt the sprint backlog. You'll recall that's the subset of features taken from the product backlog, and therefore the Daily Scrum adjusts the upcoming planned work. And of course, there are many ways to achieve that purpose. You see, the entire Scrum team is accountable for creating a valuable, useful, what's known as an increment every single sprint. So I've been talking about a potentially shippable product. This, of course, is the increment we're talking about. And the entire Scrum team consists of the Scrum Master, product owner, and developers. This development team can select whatever structure and techniques they want, providing their regular daily Scrum focuses on progress towards what's known as the sprint goal and produces an actionable plan for the next day of work. And this will create focus for the team and improve their self-management. So the original Daily Scrum was simply around each member says what we did yesterday, what I've achieved, what I intend to do today, and any problems I have. As you can see now, although that's still needed, the purpose of the Daily Scrum has a more broader and helpful approach. Now, there are many ways to achieve the purpose of the Daily Scrum. For example, rather than just looking at what you did yesterday and what you're doing today, questions could be asked such as, why isn't the story at the top of the backlog yet done? And this type of focus can lead to a large increase in team performance. Let's look next at the sprint review, again diving in a little more detail. Now, during this event, the Scrum team, customers and stakeholders, do you remember I said it'll often include a demonstration, review what was accomplished in the sprint and what has changed in their environment. And it's based on this, the attendees collaborate on what to do next. So the sprint review takes cognizance of the fact that the customer environment may be a moving feast. And the product backlog may also be adjusted to meet such new opportunities. Now, it's the product owner role that's responsible for creating the product backlog in its prioritized form. Of course, the product owner may have input from others, such as the Scrum team, but it's their responsibility. And therefore, it's the product owner's responsibility to keep the backlog up to date. And this is called grooming. So get used to that term. Grooming the product backlog is the responsibility of the product owner and should be done regularly, certainly at the start and end of each sprint. One important point, however, is that once the sprint has started, neither the product owner or anyone else for that matter can actually change the features that are going to be worked on. So the sprint review is a working session, not just a presentation, and it's important the Scrum team keeps it that way. The sprint review is a venue for customers, users, stakeholders, and the Scrum team to discuss how they achieved the sprint goal, since we're now at the end of the sprint, the progress made towards the product goal, as you might imagine, that's a higher level, and what problems have been overcome, and, importantly, what products still remain in their way. So let's now jump to sprint planning. Now this answers what can be delivered in the increment in the upcoming sprint. Remember, sprint planning happens before sprint execution, and how the work will be achieved. And a new approach here is, why is this sprint valuable? You'll find in the update of the Scrum Guide, answering the question why is a new addition, because it gives the focus on not simply just saying what are we going to do and what work we're going to carry out, but why, how this sprint contributes to the product goal. It's the product owner role who proposes how the product could increase its value and its use within the current sprint. And should, for whatever reason, the sprint need to be cancelled, it's only the product owner who has the authority to abort a sprint. The whole Scrum team then collaborates to define a sprint goal that communicates why the sprint is valuable to stakeholders. Here's this why question again. Okay, let's now look at the sprint retrospective. We know this is looking back and looking for improvements. Let's see the sort of things we want to look at here. This Scrum event has a focus on process improvements, also on team happiness, making sure everyone's working well with high motivation, and team cohesion. And this in and of itself gives individual Scrum teams flexibility on how they approach the sprint retrospective. And again, how the sprint retrospective is run should not be prescriptive. There are many ways in which the team can determine this information. So it's the Scrum team who decides on how much time is needed to refine and understand the product backlog items. A question I'm often asked is, how long should a sprint be? We know it's usually short, no more than 4 weeks, but who determines that? Well, the answer is as the Scrum team does planning, and certainly with feedback from the sprint retrospective, they can see how much time is needed to refine and understand the product backlog items, hence setting the likely duration of the upcoming sprints. And by the way, although I've explained simply that the product backlog is a list of the user stories or features or requirements in prioritized order, such user stories, requirements, whatever you want to call them, may not be for new features. They may, in some of those user stories, might be fixing existing problems or as we call them, impediments. So you could run a sprint which fixed the problem rather than simply creating a new improvement, for example. And again, it's the Scrum team that call this out. And if we can see an opportunity for large improvements, these should be addressed as soon as possible and may, as I'm suggesting, be added to the sprint backlog for the next sprint. Very good. There's a good place to pause. Thanks for your time and attention. Let's you and I meet up again on Module 2, where we will be looking at Scrum artifacts and commitments. So meanwhile, here at Projex Academy, from me, Dave Litton, it's bye for now.